Chapter 7: Ladies, Lovers, and Lifestyles, the Flowering of Medieval Culture. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a teenager when she got married in 1137. It was no ordinary wedding. The groom was the King of France. In fact, Eleanor's life was extraordinary from beginning to end. She lived in a time of new ideas, rising wealth, and passionate outbursts of faith and emotion. During the 11th and 12th centuries, medieval culture changed in ways that touched the lives of everyone from nobles to peasants. Eleanor didn't just experience those changes, she helped to inspire some of them. Romance and the arts surrounded Eleanor as she grew up in the Duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France. Her grandfather, Duke William, had been known throughout France for his love affairs and the poetry he wrote. When Eleanor was in her teens, her father died, and she became Duchess of the large fiefdom of Aquitaine. But, before he died, her father had arranged for her to marry the King of France. The French kings were always looking for heiresses to marry in order to bring more land and wealth under royal control, and marriage to the young Duchess of Aquitaine was a rare opportunity. No one asked Eleanor what she thought about it, but she kept the agreement and married the young king, Louis VII. The marriage was not a happy one. Eleanor came from a sophisticated worldly court in warm southern France. She disliked the damp chill of Paris. More important, she had little in common with her husband. Louis had been raised to join the clergy and was more like a priest or a scholar than a knight. He wasn't even supposed to be king. He inherited the throne when his older brother died. "I thought to have married a king," Eleanor is reported to have said, "but I married a monk." Real trouble between the royal couple began when Louis went on the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. By that time, Eleanor had given birth to 2 daughters, but no son to inherit the throne, so she decided to accompany her husband on the crusade, hoping to conceive an heir along the way. Dressed as female warriors, she and other noble French ladies set off in high spirits. Such bold behavior caused a scandal, but worse was to come. When the couple reached Antioch, they met Eleanor's uncle, Raymond, a handsome man and a great warrior. Eleanor left the crusade to stay with Raymond, and rumors spread that the two were lovers. Whatever the truth of that story, Eleanor had not produced a male heir by the time she and Louis returned to France. Louis asked the French bishops to annul or cancel their marriage. The Catholic Church did not allow couples to divorce. The marriage was dissolved, and Eleanor, now 30 years old, was no longer Queen of France. She was still the Duchess of Aquitaine and a desirable marriage partner. Henry, the 18-year-old Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, had met Eleanor in Paris. Now he sought her hand. Despite the age difference, a match had advantages for each. By marrying Eleanor, Henry would become Duke of Aquitaine, and by marrying Henry, Eleanor would become the wife of a man who was in line to become King of England. The two were wed in 1152, 8 weeks after Eleanor's marriage to Louis ended. The marriage was a painful blow to Louis. Henry was his greatest rival, the most powerful vassal in France, and the most rebellious. Together, Henry's fiefs were larger than the territory Louis controlled. As a further wound to Louis's dignity, Eleanor bore Henry 4 sons. A mighty feud arose between Henry and Louis. Henry had spent a lot of time traveling through his French fiefs and in England. Eleanor tended to their interests in Aquitaine. In Poitiers, the capital of Aquitaine, she headed one of Europe's most cosmopolitan courts, a center of art, learning, and style that gave birth to knightly literature and manners. Eleanor's court was part of a sweeping trend. Europeans were developing more refined tastes, and intellectual life was taking on new vitality. Love conquers all unless your name is Abelard. Contact with the Arab world brought some of the changes in taste. From the Arabs of Spain, Europeans learned to appreciate lyrical poetry, which was about the emotions, especially love. At the same time, warfare in Europe decreased because younger sons of nobles found more profit in fighting for territory outside Europe. Peace and refinement changed the medieval knight. Once a rough warrior, he now became a courtier, a term applied to a young man who knew how to behave politely in a lord's court. The new standards of knightly behavior and military virtue came to be called chivalry, from the French word chevalier, meaning mounted warrior. The code of chivalry called for a knight to be courageous, loyal, trustworthy, generous to a conquered foe, and eager to defend the Christian faith. Noble women became objects of respect and elaborate courtesy. Nowhere was this more evident than at the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor herself was highly cultivated. She was familiar with the romantic traditions of her poet grandfather, the learning of Parisian philosophers, the ways of Norman and English nobility, and the exotic culture of the East. Poets and nobles flocked to her brilliant court. Their lives of leisure and interest in the refined life produced courtoisie, meaning courtesy, a new standard of politeness, including behavior in love. Men were taught how to speak to ladies and were punished in a court of love if they offended a woman. New literary works celebrated the changing relationships between noblemen and ladies, the passionate, worshipful attitude toward women that came to be called courtly love. Poets wrote lyrical poetry, such as this stanza, to celebrate the women they adored. I sing of her, yet her beauty is greater than I can tell. With her fresh color, lovely eyes, and white skin untanned and untainted by rouge, she is so pure and noble that no one can speak ill of her. They also wrote longer tales called romances about heroines and heroes whose love was tested by separations and adventures. Many of these romances centered on the legendary figure of King Arthur. In early stories, Arthur was described as a British king who fought off Saxon invaders. Later, Arthur's legend grew more elaborate. Stories of the adventures of his knights of the Round Table were added to it. The unlawful love of his queen Guinevere for Lancelot, one of his vassals, formed the subject of such medieval literature. Courtly manners were displayed at tournaments, war games that were based on real combat. Knights on horseback charged each other on a field laid out for the fight. They tried to knock each other off their horses. When one was down, they resumed the combat on foot, fighting with swords until one surrendered. Nobles organized tournaments to practice their fighting skills. A tournament might celebrate the knighting of a son, the marriage of a daughter, the crowning of a king, or the heroic entrance of a prince into a city. In fact, any excuse was a good one for those mock battles. While poets rhymed and knights charged each other on horseback, a revival of learning took place. Students flocked to hear teachers lecture in Latin, the scholarly language of all Europe. The most sought-after teacher was Peter Abelard, born into a knightly family in Brittany, a province in western France in 1079. He could have inherited his father's lands, but instead he became fascinated by theological and philosophical arguments. Abelard settled in Paris, the center for such debates, and soon developed a reputation as a thinker, with students who paid to hear his lectures. Later in life, Abelard wrote his autobiography and called it The History of My Misfortunes, for good reason. While teaching in Paris, he was hired by a high official at Paris's great cathedral, Notre Dame, to tutor Heloise, the official's bright, beautiful young niece. But Abelard's description of their lessons told that, under the pretext of study, we spent our hours in the happiness of love, and learning held out to us the secret opportunities that our passion craved. She became pregnant, and the couple faced a dilemma. If they married, Abelard could not pursue a career in the church, because the clergy had to remain unmarried. Not wanting to ruin his career, Heloise refused to marry him. But when their son was born, they secretly married. Not knowing that they were wed, Heloise's uncle was outraged when he learned about the baby. He arranged for thugs to attack Abelard, who survived a brutal attack but retired to a monastery. Heloise also withdrew to a monastic life. Their child, a boy named Astrolabe, may have been raised by Abelard's father. In time, both Heloise and Abelard became heads of religious communities. Abelard's autobiography circulated wildly, and after reading his account of their old love, Heloise wrote to him, I beg you to restore your presence to me by writing me some word of comfort. When in the past you sought me out for sinful pleasures, your letters came to me thick and fast. She sympathized with Abelard's misfortunes, but reminded him that she, too, had suffered. In addition to new manners, poetry, and scholarship, the 12th century produced a new architectural style that modern art historians call Gothic. It shaped many medieval cathedrals. Like much else in medieval culture, Gothic architecture has a connection to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Suger, the abbot who arranged the marriage between Eleanor and Louis VII, and later oversaw their kingdom while they were on the Second Crusade, was a major supporter or patron of the new architecture. Gothic architecture departed in important ways from the early Romanesque style. The walls of Romanesque churches were built of heavy masonry, as was typical of Roman buildings too. The thick walls limited the height of the churches, as well as the number and size of windows. Gothic architecture took a different approach. Rather than placing all the weight of a roof on the walls, the builders created an external skeleton of ribs or arches called flying buttresses. These helped support the weight of the roofs. The walls, freed from having to bear all the weight, could have bigger windows and more of them. The change was revolutionary. Within 50 years, builders all over Europe had abandoned Romanesque architecture for Gothic. But as with any change, the transition was not entirely smooth. Some calamities occurred. Faulty engineering could cause a whole roof of a church to collapse. Building a cathedral was a complex undertaking that often took centuries. Some say, in fact, that cathedrals are never completed. New work is always added or old work mended. A cathedral started with the bishop and his clergy, who financed the project. Some bishops invested the church's revenue in cathedrals. Pious patrons gave money for windows, bells, and maintenance. The bishop then hired an architect to design the building and do much more. As foreman of the project, the architect hired master masons, carpenters, stonecutters, sculptors, and carvers. Master craftsmen designed and supervised each stage of the project, down to casting the metal bells and making the stained glass windows, but apprentices and less skilled craftsmen did most of the work. Many unskilled laborers dug the foundations, carried the stones, set up the scaffolding, and performed other heavy work. Play nice and share your trencher. The 12th and 13th centuries must have been golden years for architects, masons, carpenters, and even laborers. Growing towns built walls around their edges, partly to protect themselves, but also to show civic pride. Wealthy merchants and clergy built houses in the towns, and nobles built castles in the countryside. A 12th century castle was far more complex than the original motte and bailey structure. The motte became a central stone tower called a keep, designed to be defended from attack. Walls as thick as 15 feet extended below ground, creating basement rooms that served as dungeons or prisons. The next level up had storerooms for barrels of wine, flour, salted fish, and other provisions, perhaps also a guard room and rooms for storing weapons. On the main level was the Great Hall, the center of castle life. Everyone took their meals in the hall, and many people slept on its floor after the tables had been put away for the night. The lord of the castle governed and entertained guests in the Great Hall, and he and his family lived in the upper stories. Castles were defensive structures, but because they were so effective, few of them were attacked. The best way to assault a castle was to lay siege, surrounding the castle and cutting off its food supplies, and its water too, if it did not have its own well. After the Crusades, machines for attacking castles became more common. One such machine was like a battering ram, which could break down the gate. Ladders and movable wooden towers let attackers scramble over the castle walls. Another effective tactic against castles' fortifications was to sap or dig under the walls so that they would eventually collapse. When castles were not under attack, which was most of the time, life in them was fairly comfortable. Wells provided drinking water. Water for washing came from a cistern, a tank on the roof that collected rain. Pipes carried water from the cistern through spigots into wash basins called lavatories in the living quarters and the Great Hall. The castle's latrines might flow into chutes within the walls, or they might be outside the keep and drop directly to the ground or into the moat. One English king left a vivid record of his plumbing problems when he begged his engineers, for the love of God, to fix the latrines in a castle he visited frequently. The cold updrafts and their odor were unbearable. Noble children who grew up in castles were not necessarily raised by their parents, who might be away at other castles, on crusade, or at the king's court. Nurses fed and entertained them. When children were 7 or 8, their parents usually sent them to live with another noble family of high status, a custom called fostering. In their temporary new homes, young people learned court manners. Boys and girls learned to ride and to hunt, to wash their hands before coming to the table, to eat properly with their fingers, forks had not yet come into use, and to share their trenchers, a piece of rough bread that served as a plate, with their dinner partner. They were not to make a noise as you sup, wrote the author of the young children's book, or to throw their bones to the dog. Make neither the cat nor the dog your fellow at the table. Girls and boys were treated much the same when young, but later they were trained for different roles. Young women spent most of their time in the castle's women's quarters, learning to sew and embroider, read romances and lyric poetry, play musical instruments and cards, and dance. Young men became squires, knights in training, and learned to fight, practicing with the sword and lance. Some young squires accompanied their lords to battles or on crusades. A squire became a knight in a special ceremony, usually when he reached the age of 21. A young nobleman or noblewoman's future depended a lot on birth order. Younger children might be prepared for careers in church administration or monastic life, while older children, as heirs to their parents' property, generally married. Their parents or lords arranged their marriages, which were political or economic alliances between families. The two families often held intense negotiations about the marriage terms. The bride's family was expected to give the groom a dowry or a gift of property. Dowries could consist of land, jewels, gold and silver serving vessels, war horses, armor, fine clothing, even armies. Princess Philippa, who married the future King Edward III of England, brought to her marriage a dowry of boats and fighting men that the groom's mother used to invade England in his name. In exchange for the dowry, a husband's family promised a dower, a benefit for a wife if her husband died. It consisted of a third of his lands and estates. A wife could use the dower land for as long as she lived, and after her death it would go to their children. Both marriages of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the godmother of courtly love, were arranged after much negotiation about dowries, dowers, and other terms. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France had been unsatisfactory to both partners. Her second to Henry II of England was at times stormy. Like many royal families, the family of Eleanor and Henry was torn by rival ambitions. At one point, Eleanor and one of her sons rebelled against Henry with the support of France. As a result, Henry had Eleanor confined for more than a decade to a castle in England. After Henry's death, though, Eleanor again involved herself in politics and in the careers of two of her sons who became kings of England. She was still active at the age of about 80 when she led the defense of one of her castles against a siege by her own grandson. As her grandfather Duke William once wrote, "I pray that at my death all my friends will honor me, for I have known joy and gaiety in my domains and far away." Eleanor truly experienced medieval life in all such fullness.